It's the real news. I'm Aaron Mate. Hillary Clinton continues to at least partly blame alleged Russian meddling for her loss to Donald Trump. This week, she said Russia didn't just target her campaign, but the entire country.
Look, I take responsibility for every decision I made, but that's not why I lost. So I think it's important that we learn the real lessons from this last campaign, because the forces that we are up against are not just interested in influencing our elections and our politics. They're going after our economy, and they're going after our unity as a nation.
The claim Russia is influencing U.S. politics with White House help won't go away. But a rarely asked question is why there is such an adversarial U.S. relationship with Russia in the first place. Well, a new book explores this question. It's called The Plot to Scapegoat Russia: How the CIA and the Deep State Have Conspired to Vilify Putin. The book's author is Dan Kovalik, a human rights and labor attorney. Welcome, Dan.
Hi, thank you.
Thanks for joining us. So, accusing the CIA and the Deep State of conspiring to vilify Putin, as your book title does, those are strong words. What do you mean by that?
Well, what I mean is that and this has been going on even before the 2016 election cycle, for the last number of years, there has been an attempt, a successful attempt, to vilify Russia, and in particular Vladimir Putin. It's being done by various parts of the intelligence community, as well as the compliant media, to great success. And I think it's being done in order to justify keeping the U.S. on continued permanent war footing. You know, after the Soviet Union collapsed, first of all, I think the Russians thought once communism collapsed that the U.S. and the West would be friends with them. They thought that the U.S. was anti-communist but not anti-Russia. But in fact, as the years went on, it appeared maybe, in fact, the U.S. was also anti-Russian. You know, we agreed with Mikhail Gorbachev. It's well established that we agreed with Mikhail Gorbachev that the Berlin Wall would come down if NATO would not move 1 inch east of Germany. And in fact, we are now up to the Russian frontier, NATO is. And with Macedonia just having been added as, I think, the 28th member of NATO. And so I think the Russians scratch their heads as to why we feel we need to have NATO troops up to the border, and also feel disappointed as to why we couldn't be friends after the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Okay, there are many people, especially I think those who watch MSNBC, who would say, well, why not vilify Putin? He's a right-wing kleptocrat. There's repression at home in Russia. He's homophobic. There's obviously repression in Chechnya. He's been bombing civilians in Syria. He meddled in Ukraine. So why not vilify a leader like that?
One doesn't have to accept that Putin's a great guy or a great leader in order to realize that the vilification is based on very exaggerated facts, if you want to call them facts. Look, first of all, let's start with one fact, that Putin is a very popular leader in Russia. Polls show him polling at, between 70 and 80%. Does he have some authoritarian qualities? Yes. There was a homophobic law passed when he was president, which of course I oppose, and I think people should be critical of. What's happening in Chechnya, I want to say, is something more complicated. You know, Russia had 2 recent wars with Chechnya. To put what's happening on Chechnya on Putin's doorstep, I think, is not totally fair. I think Russia has a limited amounts of control about what happens there. In any case, why is Russia being singled out for these types of things? Trump just went to Saudi Arabia and signed a $110 billion military deal with them. And Obama also sold them huge amounts of arms. Saudi Arabia is not democratic. It is a monarchy. It is less democratic than Russia. It is homophobic. It is anti-woman. It is now waging a war in Yemen with U.S. support that is now very likely to kill millions of people. The UN calls it the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. And yet, there's no uproar about that in the United States. Yes, you can point to Putin in Syria, and we can debate, his conduct there. You can debate his conduct in Ukraine, but now you've pretty much run out of examples, haven't you? The U.S. has destroyed Libya, it's destroyed Iraq, it's destroyed Afghanistan, it's helping Saudi Arabia destroy Yemen. It actually has played its own nefarious role in Syria and Ukraine. Why is it that Putin is being singled out for the couple interventions he's doing? Meanwhile, there's very little outcry in this country, especially amongst liberals who you would think would know better, against the massive interventions in all these other countries. It just seems bizarre to me.
Okay, Dan. Okay, so you've answered the why, and your take on it is that there are parts of the U.S. state that want to keep America on a permanent war footing, in your words, and so the target, or one of the targets, is Russia. But then let's get to the how, because the subtitle of your book is How the CIA and the Deep State Have Conspired to Vilify Putin. So how have they done that?
Well, I think one is you have a constant drumbeat from sectors of the U.S. government that are constantly singling out countries like Russia. Venezuela is another one, for criticism of all the things you said and others. And you have a media which has become less and less critical of the narrative that's being pushed by those sectors of the government. They're just willing to, essentially spout whatever is given to them. And because of this daily, I'll give you an example of this. I happen to listen to NPR every day. I don't know why, because I think it's terrible, but I guess it's a habit like any other. And they constantly have a drumbeat every day about Russia, okay? Every day about Venezuela, practically. Meanwhile, they don't discuss what's happening in next door Colombia, where you have much worse human rights violations than in Venezuela, and they're being sponsored by the United States. Again, they'll talk about Russia and Syria every day, but barely ever mention Yemen, and when they do, they almost never mention the U.S. role in the worst humanitarian crisis in Yemen. So I think how they do it in the way that Chomsky and Herman talked about in their book Manufacturing Consent. The establishment talks every day disproportionately about the misdeeds, or some real, some imagined, of our enemies, while remaining mute and almost silent about the crimes of the U.S. itself and its allies. That is how it's done, and it's very effective.
All right, Dan, so listen, on this point of the media and how it covers Russia, which I want to focus on, there was a really interesting development today, which is that the French cybersecurity agency came out and said that there's no trace of Russian hacking behind Russian hacking work behind the hack that was targeted at the French President Macron on the eve of the recent French election. And when this happened, there were widespread reports that there was Russian hacking targeting Macron in favor of Le Pen. And it certainly is true that Putin is friendly with Le Pen, but this story of Russian hacking in France was widespread. Now France says there's no evidence of that, and I'm pretty sure that revelation will not get nearly as much play as the original story did.
Right. Well, that's exactly right. And by the way, I'd seen a story that Germany had also done. There had been some time ago claims that Putin had interfered in German elections. Germany's intelligence community ended up debunking those. And yeah, so you have the media is quite quick to jump to conclusions about alleged meddling, for example, by Russia in elections. And by the way, much quicker than evidence could possibly warrant, right? And as you say, once those tend to be debunked, you don't hear about them again. Another example another nemesis of the U.S., North Korea, you might remember 2 years ago, was accused of hacking Sony. And in fact, Obama sanctioned North Korea based on the allegations North Korea hacked Sony. But in fact, it turned out later that most people agreed, and in mainstream press quietly had to admit that it was probably an inside job. Someone at Sony had done it themselves, not North Korea. But basically, as you say, there was little said about it. The problem was forgotten. The sanctions remain, and the vilification continues. And that is the problem with what's happening now. I understand that the Democrats don't like Trump. They shouldn't. I mean, I don't like him either. He's doing, backed out of the Paris environmental accords. His domestic policies are retrograde. I get that. They're searching for ways to undermine. Fair enough. But to latch on to this anti-Russian hysteria, and it is a hysteria, in order to accomplish that, is very short-sighted. The stink of this vilification of Russia will linger way beyond this crisis with Donald Trump. And it could lead us towards a confrontation with Russia, a nuclear state, that none of us would want, and they're very dangerous. In the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, which keeps the nuclear clock, moved it to 3 minutes to midnight, suggesting that in fact we're closer to possible nuclear confrontation, in particular with Russia, than we ever have been since I think like 1953. And so this should be of grave concern to people. And I think this is a very dangerous game that's been played for some time, again, even before the 2016 elections, but now is certainly being played on a daily basis, in particular by the liberal establishment, which I find a bit ironic given at least what they claim to stand for. And it's very dangerous. And that is why I wrote the book that I wrote. I think Russia, for all of its faults, is a worthy ally. I always go back to the fact that the first world leader to call George Bush after 9/11 was Vladimir Putin, to offer his condolences, to offer to help in Afghanistan, and he did help in U.S. operations in Afghanistan. He helped Obama negotiate the nuclear deal with Iran. He also helped broker a peace agreement with Obama in Syria, you might recall, in September of last year, which was quickly obliterated when the U.S. military accidentally, on purpose, bombed 60-some Syrian soldiers a few days after that agreement was reached. I mean, these are the things people should be concerned about. Do we actually have civilian control government? You have the president, Obama, reaching an agreement with Putin only to have the military undermined. And this happens over and over. And I think what's happening with Trump, again, while I disagree with him on most issues, I actually agree with his policies of wanting peace with Russia. And that seems to be the policy amongst all others that is totally unacceptable to parts of the U.S. government, the FBI, the CIA, for example, and the liberal establishment, the Democratic Party. That is the thing, and you mentioned Rachel Maddow, that is the thing that is upsetting people more than anything, when in fact it seems to me we should be welcoming at least an attempt to have a peaceful relationship with that country.
Okay, Dan, just to make a point about welcoming harmony between the U.S. and Russia, I agree with you, but I'm not sure if that means we should blanketly accept it. So certainly Russia cooperating with the U.S. in the so-called war on terror, I'm not sure is necessarily a good thing. But let me ask you, since you bring up Trump and him wanting friendly relations with Russia, why do you think Trump wants to be so friendly with Russia?
But
go ahead.
I don't know exactly why. I think, frankly, because in part it's common sense. I mean, it doesn't take a genius to want that. Does he possibly have old business ties that lead him to want to do that? Sure, that's possible. I know he's accused of that. I accept that's probably true, but that doesn't make it wrong, right? I mean, I note in my book, for example, that when Hillary Clinton was um, Secretary of State, the Clinton Foundation accepted millions of dollars of donations from Saudi Arabia, and that she then turned around and helped approve some military sales to Saudi Arabia. Again, people aren't concerned about those types of ties. Everyone has ties. Once you become president, you have ties to someone. And again, the question is, to me, whether the ties or whether the country you have ties with is one that we consider an enemy or a friend. And I think Russia should be considered a friend. And if that's the case, then what is the problem? And then I don't see it.
Well, Dan Kovalik, I want to thank you for joining us. The book is The Plot to Scapegoat Russia, How the CIA and the Deep State Have Conspired to Vilify Putin. Dan, thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on The Real News.